welcome everyone. Good afternoon from Geneva. Pleasure to be with you this afternoon. My name is Ho Lim. I'm Director for the Trade and Environment Division at the WTO, and I will be moderating this webinar on greening global value chains. This is the third webinar of a webinar series that is being jointly organized by Economic Research and my division, the Trade and Environment Division. It's part of our ongoing work this year on the World Trade Report 2022, which will be on trade and climate change. So as part of this work, the webinar series, is essentially to try to inform the debate around the trade and environment and climate change nexus. It bears without saying that climate change, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, adapting to climate change is a global imperative. So in today's webinar, we will be discussing a very important part of how can we mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, and that is through the greening of global value chains. And of course, since we're talking about trade, if we can green global value chains, we will also, of course, be greening trade. So in this regard, I'm really pleased that we're able to have with us two globally renowned experts, providing us with management and logistics perspectives in this regard. This will really provide us, I think, very fresh and very useful insights on the role of WTO and trade policy in relation to decarbonizing of supply chains, as well as, of course, the related transport and logistics services. So once again, my two speakers, we have Professor Joseph Sarkis and Professor Maria Hugo Broden, and they will each be taking the floor. But let me start by just introducing them a bit more properly to you. Professor Sarkis is a professor of management at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in the United States. His teaching and research interests are in the fields of environmental sustainability, operations and supply chain management. He has authored many publications, I think well over 500 publications. He's the editor of very important journals on engineering management and supply chains, sustainable supply chains in particular. And he's also an international program coordinator for the working group of the Future Earth Systems of Sustainable Consumption and Production Knowledge Action Network. I thought WTO had complicated acronyms, but that was quite a good one. Professor Sarkis holds a PhD in Management Services from the State University of New York at Buffalo. So great pleasure to have you join us. Let me also introduce Professor Maria Hugo Broden, who is Professor in Green Logistics Management at Linköping University in Sweden. Research analyzes strategies for green logistics in supply chains, and also looking at how logistics service providers can meet the climate challenge while maintaining profitability and competitiveness. Again, Professor Hugo Broden has a very extensive publication record. She's part of very important national and international research networks on logistics and supply chains, and she's also leading strategic collaboration between Linköping University and the Swedish National Road and Transport Research Institute. So, we have this really very great expertise on this panel, and so we'll start by hearing their presentations, which will take around 15 to 20 minutes each. And thereafter, we will have some time for questions and answers and discussion. So I do invite you to really start as you hear the presentations to insert your questions into the chat box, as well as any comments, actually, for that matter, should you have a comment. We try to run these webinars as interactively as possible, and I think we'll have a very good 1 hour. So let me turn first to Professor Sarkis, who will be sharing with us some of his insights on greening supply chains. So with that very brief introduction, let me turn to you, Professor Sarkis. The floor is yours, as they say.
Thank you, Hugo. It's very much a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me. So let me share my screen here, make sure it's in the right way, and I assume everybody can see that. Um, so the topic of my talk today, and there's a lot to be talked about, I only have 20 minutes or so, is this complex situation of nexus of multiple activities that are occurring in green supply chains. I'll give a quick overview of green supply chains and what they have, but the topics primarily will focus on digitization, circular economy, and due diligence. It's an interesting new emergent area related to international trade and global supply chains and how that all fits in. And again, every single one of these topics probably could be a whole 3-hour presentation, if not a course. So you're going to get a lot of information very quickly. So I apologize up front, but hopefully there's some questions and it'll provide some ideas for you as you go along. Okay, this is the agenda or the outline. I'm going to give a quick background on some global supply chains. I don't know what the background is of most of the individuals here. Sometimes I do a little bit more background, sometimes do a little bit less. Some digital technologies and green supply chain, how they kind of work together. Specific digital technology, and many of you have probably heard of this technology, blockchain technology in green supply chain, which is one of my more recent areas of research. And then I start going over to circular economy, which is similar to green supply chain. You need green supply chains for a circular economy, and circular economies contribute to green supply chain and blockchain. And then the due diligence, a couple aspects of the due diligence issue, because I view this as being the way the future will probably go in terms of diffusing the greening of value chains or supply chains globally. And some future concerns and implications, a lot of these dealing more with policy rather than specific industries or organizational decisions. And of course, it affects all the levels in some way or other. So as we know, modern supply chains are complex. They're geographically disjointed, as we found out that they can break very easily if there's a major crisis. There's inefficient transactions, fraud, pilferage. These are social as well as environmental sustainability. Traceability, transparency is very difficult because of the complexities, because of the globalization. And there's lots of cost, especially with many intermediaries. And these intermediaries are needed such that the supply chain doesn't break down, as we've seen over and over again. But again, this all adds to the complexity and lack of visibility in modern supply chains, not necessarily just green supply chains. So, and part of these issues are information or digitalization issues, information sharing, digital information, media information, these types of things. And part of the issue has to do with the centralized model, which essentially results in single points of failures, less resiliency, systems not communicating with each other very well. And if one portion of the system breaks down, nobody else knows what's going on. So these are some of the issues related to resiliency, but also information management issues with the traditional supply chain. And I mentioned these issues because digitalization could help solve some of them, not all of them. This is a multi-tier, multi-stakeholder type of digitalization. So now let's go into a little bit of some of the digital technology. I still haven't defined green supply chain yet, but I'll come up to that a little bit later. This kind of starts going into that direction itself. So some of the emergent digital technologies, and there's many more digital technologies that I don't even mention here that exist. We can, under the umbrella of Industry 4.0, for example, has about 10 or 12 different types of technologies that are integrative, multi-stakeholder, across the supply chain and in fact impact the supply chain in many different ways. The three that I show here are the Internet of Things, blockchain technology, and quantum computing. And this comes from a paper that we recently had published last year, essentially titled Digitalization and the Greening of Supply Chains. So if you're more interested in this topic, there's a paper there, Sarkis et al. 2021. And essentially what you look at here is if you look across the columns, each of the columns, a supply chain typically has, in my case, about four major segments. You have the upstream supply chain, the organization itself, the focal firm supply chain and its management, and the downstream supply chain, which essentially goes out to the customer, sells the product, distributes it, and so on. And another one, and this is what makes this more of a green supply chain, is the idea of closing the loop. That materials aren't disposed of, products are not disposed of at the end. Somehow the after end of life products are brought back into the system as a closed loop system. And this kind of relates also to the circular economy later on. So for example, the Internet of Things is smartphones, the internet, of course, and everything that's linked up using the cloud computing type of stuff. And I give examples here. For example, upstream supply chains, green sourcing of materials is going to be critical when you look upstream in the supply chain. When you're looking at closing the loop, how do you go about determining the product lifecycle management? End of life materials would be a closing the loop thing with the Internet of Things. If you know where products are and materials are after use, then it's easier to bring them back into the system. This is the same idea that blockchain technology, and I'll describe a little bit more about blockchain technology. Quantum computing, the reason why I put quantum computing, this is a very emergent technology, still in the research stages, which essentially allows the computational capabilities of computer systems to expand in magnitudes. So what was this? Essentially, supercomputers are probably the most powerful computers. This raises the computational capabilities of supercomputers to solve problems that were previously unsolvable very quickly. And why is this important? Because this relates to how efficient these other technologies can operate very quickly. So when you have big data that needs to be managed, quantum computing can do it in a fraction of the time. This is still very much a research area, and we talk about that as some of the items. But optimization and planning, especially with big data, are the major aspects of why I put quantum computing in this review. Now let's look at the traditional supply chain. Very linear, use, and get rid of, and so on. And the systems don't talk to each other. They talk dyadically. That is, two systems, the two organizations talk to each other at a time, whether it's customer to buyer. There's a lot of dyads in there. That's a traditional supply chain. The idea now, moving into the blockchain-based supply chain, is that there's lots of visibility, lots of communications. Everyone sees, this is ideally, of course, I have a whole presentation about the limitations. I'm just giving you a very scratch the surface idea here, that everybody can see what's going on. And there's multiple organizations that are involved here, multiple stakeholders from standards organizations, certifiers. I didn't put the WTO in there. WTO could be in there as well somehow. But notice that the access, there's smart contracts that are involved. There's distributed ledgers that are visible to everyone. There's a consensus-based mechanism to make sure the data is accurate and secure and so on. If you want more information about the blockchain, there's a paper that we published in 2019 by Sabari et al. That describes this in detail. Some of the limitations, some of the capabilities, but the major capabilities typically are things like incentivization, the idea, and I'll mention some of those later on, security and reliability, transparency and visibility, and the efficiencies involved in all of these different types of transactions. Lots of limitations, lots of costs, still an emergent technology whose potential is still unsure, but it's one of the areas that can contribute to the greening of the supply chain. And how does it support it? These are some examples that we have. And this is from another paper by Hosida and Sarkis. This diagram is used with lots of examples. And all the examples we show here, we describe them in more detail in our other paper here. So for example, from an upstream perspective, you could track suppliers. You could actually remove intermediaries, because blockchain, part of the intermediaries are to make sure things are flowing appropriately and that they're being tracked appropriately. This could make it a less, complex supply chain, and you may not need some of the intermediaries to manage the information in the process. Blockchain could get around some of that. Auditing and performance measurements are very important. And we get to the audit and performance measurement issues because of the transparency and visibility issues that is going to be important later on. From a carbon perspective, how do we know that our supply chain is emitting carbon at such and such a level. This is part of the auditing perspective. And how do we know that certain certificates that are bought or certain savings in carbon emissions in one area of the supply chain are actually occurring? This is how the consensus mechanisms, the blockchain immutability of data, and other capabilities will allow you to see what's going on. The other capability of the blockchain from that aspect is it's an incentivization mechanism. Now, supply chain finance may change greatly in this situation. So the incentives to do certain things can be done very quickly, either trade or either performance, development, shifting of resources across the global supply chain are all possible. That's the upstream portion. Internally to the organization, how do you monitor it? How do you trace sustainability issues? How do you integrate the items? And also, there's practices here, like blockchain can facilitate crowdsourcing and crowd shipping, the middle item there, in the sense that if there is available capacity, for example, on ocean liners, the blockchain can tell you that that capacity is available, and you might be able to get a really good deal while still benefiting the environment by making full use of the transportation and the capacities of the supply chain from those areas that would have gone empty otherwise. And there's many examples of those. And we move on down, there's different types of performance metrics and techniques. Then you have the distribution logistics. I think Maria is going to be talking about some of those issues, not necessarily from the blockchain perspective, but in general from a green perspective. And then closing the loop, bringing us some of the reverse logistics issues. So what I'm also showing here are the different areas where you can do greening in your supply chain, whether it's your organization or cross organization. And and notice here, the reverse logistics helps facilitate circular economy activities, this closing of the loop. How do you bring the materials back in? How do you trace the materials? And if you do it, can you do it globally? This is one of the difficulties. If you sell a product or material that is manufactured in Germany and it goes down to Singapore and is used in India, for example, how do you know that material can be brought back into the closed loop supply chain? This is where the complexities come in. Now, the right sensors, the right technologies, you can determine where something is anywhere in the world at a given time with relative accuracy if the blockchain is working as the way they mentioned it should be working. There's also issues related to marketing, designing of products, and so on that we don't get into. Emissions trading, energy management is a big aspect of the supply chain. And blockchain trading of carbon credits, for example, is something that's being considered right now in development as well. So those are just some of the scratching the surface aspects of how digitization, blockchain in this case, can support the green supply chain. And we also have other techniques. Now let's move on to the next topic here. This itself has been, what would you say, volumes and volumes of special issues have occurred on the circular economy. For me, the circular economy has always been part of the issue of greening the supply chains. But they're not always the same thing. Notice here, the closing of the loop is a big aspect of it, depending on where you close the loop. And this is the famous Ellen MacArthur butterfly diagram. But again, a lot of this was developed by Walter Stahl from 1980s, early 1980s, for example. The ideas have been around for decades, if not centuries. And there's even a stuff going back to the medieval times about how circular economy. It's actually going back to the basics of making do with what you have primarily, especially in local situations. So we did do some research on this. We said, okay, let's start looking at the circular economy and how blockchain can affect the circular economy. So we did this one study, this is still in works right now, where we essentially asked what aspects of the blockchain, transparency and traceability, security and reliability, smart contracts, that was the one I didn't mention, which could be a very important aspect of these systems, and incentivization and tokenization, these blockchain characteristics, where can they contribute to the various aspects here along each of the rows? And these rows are circular economy practices based on the European Commission's definitions of circular economy performance metrics. So we took that, we asked a bunch of experts who were working in blockchain and circular economy to answer a series of questions. And what we found is that incentivization, surprisingly, and tokenization has the most possible current applications to managing the performance of the circular economy. I was surprised. I would have thought it would be transparency and traceability is what we initially guessed, but it became out to be incentivization and tokenization. And this essentially means that we believe that the systems in place with blockchain technology, that capability can benefit much more. And the idea here is that incentivization and tokenization gets to a core issue of managing the whole supply chain, not technologically, but behaviorally. How do you get organizations to change behaviorally to adopt different aspects of the circular economy and or greening of supply chains? How do you get organizations to act behaviorally to trade carbon credits? How do you know the carbon credits are being traded? How the tokenization incentivization can make it more convenient for trading, whereas companies didn't know how to do it before. This could be done internationally if done appropriately. Trading of credits might be a good way of using incentivization tokenization, especially if there's savings from a circular economy perspective. And we also looked at this from the different practices, the current practices, but this was from 2020. The thing about this digitization environment is it's changing very quickly. I've never really seen this before in terms of supply chain management, how quickly a new field has emerged. Within the last 5 years, it went from like one paper to hundreds, if not thousands of papers on this topic. Within 5 years, I have never seen this type of phenomenon before. And I may never see it again, but for some reason, this has hit a very important, from both practitioners and from researchers, a very important point, a very important characteristic that everybody feels is lots of potential. I haven't seen this actually since the beginnings of the internet. So I don't know if that's a lot of hype or if it's actually going to occur. That's something we need to discuss. Anyway, what we found is optimization. And the reason why optimization seems to be a very big practice. This is the previous one did a little bit of industry, but most of it were academics who believed that that graphic, that heat map. This one here is practices that are actually occurring, at least in 2019, of different industries. We felt optimization, which is essentially making things more efficient in the supply chain from a circular economy perspective, would be the major items. We also, in the last couple of years, for some reason, there was this big pandemic or something. Some of you may have missed it. I don't know. The COVID idea. And this is where we started doing research is like, what are the lessons that we can get from COVID related especially to resilience? And how does that relate to the sustainable or green supply chains? Resilience, supply chain efficiency, and sustainability simultaneously. And we came up with three major principles based on our readings and what's going on in the situation. Localization helps with both the environmental and with resilience. Agility helps, being able to change quickly. Circular economy and green supply chains, because you have to think in different ways, because you have to do things a little bit more differently, allows you to be more agile in your system, as well as the system itself allows it to be agile. And digitization, of course, that's very common. Virtualization, and we've seen this, even this presentation here has a lot to do with virtualization. That is, I'm not there physically. I'm doing all this virtually. This webinar is a virtual situation. We did a study and we showed some different characteristics of, on the left-hand side, the different circular economy resources, on the bottom portion here, the blockchain technology. So we found that organizations with greater blockchain technology resources and capabilities, and with greater emphasis on circular economy resources and capabilities, are able to do LAD, localization, agility, and digitalization much more effectively to address issues. And this was our paper that got published in 2021, Nandi et al. As well. So there's more information about how we did that study, and we found this situation. There's industry implications, size of organization implications, as well as outcomes in terms of localization, agility, and digitization, develop resilience. Okay. Now we move from blockchain technology and circular economy to greening to due diligence. And this one is very important because this is an emergent issue that's occurring. Now companies are liable for, could be potentially liable for something that occurs anywhere in the world in terms of bad practices in their supply chain. A lot of the situations now, a lot of the bad things are very much socially oriented as well as socially oriented and legally oriented, and not as much as environmental issues, but it's something to be considered. And moving along here, because I have a lot to discuss, and just to finish up a little bit here, is that there's issues related to this whole idea of how do we get the due diligence? That is making sure that you manage all the items in your supply chain effectively. And some of the recommendations from policymakers, possible solutions that we have already been mentioned, but I summarized them here. Refinement, further development of interorganizational technologies to be able to make sure that you are doing your due diligence, that you have transparency, that you know what's going on deep into your supply chain, so you are not financially liable for that, that at least you're doing your due diligence and you will not get fined hundreds of millions of euros for it. That's the ultimate thing. Right now, it's very much early in the process. The European Union has done some drafts things. Germany has the due diligence in the supply chain in France. And the idea here is that there's teeth behind this due diligence. It's not just voluntary industry neoliberal policies, but governmental policies where you could be taken to court for something a supplier somewhere in Vietnam is doing that's bad for the environment or bad for society. So that's something that may change. And there's some statistics that show that some of it's working based on, for example, the WE requirements and how much recycling is being carried out globally on that situation. One of the other questions, and now let me get to the questions here. And these are future questions based on this. What will industry and which industries will adopt digitalization for green supply chains? This could also be which countries can or will. And there's a digital divide issue going on here, and this gets into developing country issues. Will digitalization live up to the promise? This is still very much in the early portions. Visibility, efficiency, acceptance. Can it meet all the capabilities? Can it meet the promise that it's presenting and its potential? Is circular economy really resilient? Should it be global or should it not be? And we had a whole webinar around whether or not circular economy should be global. What are the advantages and disadvantages? And we can talk about some of those issues. What is the roles of circular economy, digitalization, due diligence, and greening? I think these are all open questions. There's lots of research that's going on right now trying to figure it out. And one of the most important issues that we're all facing right now, will supply chain resilience improve overall based on any of these principles that we talked about? I think that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Joseph. I mean, you covered a lot of ground and we didn't have much time, but you did it very comprehensively and also very clearly. So thank you for that. I'm sure, we'll have a lot to discuss. So let me turn quickly now to Professor Hugo Broden. Maria, please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will start sharing my screen as well. You don't see my screen, or do you? No? Try again.
We saw your screen, but we had many different parts of your screen.
Yeah.
We see your slide. Your slide is there.
Yes.
You may have to open up that slide.
So?
Yep.
Yeah, we see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a very nice situation to be in and a very nice audience to meet, I hope. My name is Maria Hugo Broden. I work as a professor of green logistics management at Linköping University, and I am to take a management perspective here. And I thank you, Joe, by the way, for giving us such a comprehensive overarching view. I will go a little bit more into details. Although talking of supply chains, you never be can be too detailed, I think, because it's kind of management. It's on the top level of companies and so on. A very brief history of me. I did my PhD in reverse logistics, as it was called in the 90s, logistic systems recycling. I have studied logistic structure strategies, business models for logistic systems, and so on. And lately, much of our projects focus on the effects of logistics from new propulsion technologies. That is electrification of transportation. How does that affect logistics and so on? And now I work as a professor of green logistics management at Linköping University since 2014. And since we do management research in practice, our research design here is mainly qualitative case studies, and it's actually the aim is to understand new phenomena, and we go on to find new phenomena and try to inspire theory building by setting the first blocks of knowledge and understanding. And so that's where we are in a theory building context. And also, as a kind of remark, I do research mainly on the European continent and focused on Scandinavian aspects. And I see that's a restriction in a global context, but I know of it. So please ask me about it if you want to. So I start very basically, quite detailed here. What is green logistics? Well, actually, I looked this up on Wikipedia in another occasion, and this is quite comprehensive. Green logistics describes all attempts to measure and minimize ecological impact of logistics activities. So that means the environmental part of sustainability is there, and also the economical part of sustainability, at least from a firm perspective. And green logistics can be studied in different ways, and different themes that have occurred is these. These are examples, of course. Reducing freight transport externalities has to do with selecting fuels and minimizing transport work. City logistics, that has to do with last mile transport and last mile deliveries that we see in city areas mostly. Reverse logistics, Joe, you addressed that as the new things that we also understand when we study circular economics. We have to take care of reverse logistics in that sense. Logistics and corporate environmental strategies, that is both for manufacturing companies, it's for trading companies, and of course for logistics companies. And finally, green supply chain management, which are green aspects all over the supply chain. And all these themes are, of course, overlapping, but that gives you perhaps an idea of how wide this topic can be. I'd also say logistics is essential for trade. We have a row and a range of different projects relating to trade here at the university, because logistics is important to trade, in particular compared to manufacturing companies, where logistics only makes a small part of sales and a small part of the life cycle analysis. When we then look at environmental consequences of logistics, we can see that 90% of the consequences, they stem from freight transport. However, you cannot only address freight transport to make logistics greener. You have to start at another angle. And this picture is just to show you a little bit the perspectives. We can see here the top level in this picture is the freight flow. And that is green supply chain, as Joe described previously, the manufacturing trading firms setting their logistics and requiring logistic services. Often nowadays they come from the transport network, which is the network of intermediaries, different transport companies, and in the middle we have the transport market. So when we do green logistics research, we focus on these two layers. Another way of describing this is to show a picture of the supply chain, or rather the supply chain network. And in this one, we split between the product supply chain on the upper level, that is the usual supply chain that we talk of. But we also added the transport provision chain, which is actually active in all the interconnections between those supplier, sub-supplier, manufacturing, and so on, to be able to transport the material, the goods between companies. And that's what materializes as the supply chain in the end. And green logistics has a lot of management perspectives, and there are, of course, a lot of management perspectives in the supply chain. But Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about this make and buy perspective, and that is make and buy logistic services mainly. And when we studied this, we started off from a framework by Alan McKinnon, which actually describes the effects of manipulating the logistics system and its effect on carbon dioxide and environmental hazards. And it's quite complex, but it's very efficient, and it goes to the logistics system level. But we study actors, so we needed to translate this into an actor's perspective. So we tried to see how can these types of efforts be manifested when you study logistics service providers offering and when you study shippers' requirements or the customers' requirements. So we ended up in a kind of list of green logistics practices that we have used further and other researchers also use now, that comprise quite a wide range of different practices. It's logistics practices, that is the logistics system design, transport management, intermodal transport. Technology issues such as greener vehicles in use, alternative fuels, and that is in particular interesting today when we talk about different propulsion, not only fuels, but also electrification on different types. Efficient buildings, and also this one, behavior, eco-driving. That can be, of course, a management issue, but it's also a technological issues. And that alone can have quite tremendous effect on the greening of a supply chain or logistics operation. In the management side, we could talk of environmental management systems and emission data. And this research was done almost 10 years ago, and I think we can nowadays include quite a lot of more environmental management issues than these two. What we also added here was external aspects of activities, and that is when you select your partner, the environment could be or could be not an important driver. If you want to go green, you should go for a green supplier as well. And we also have seen that different collaboration projects are a very important vehicle towards greening logistics, because in collaborations you get to know each other, you build your relationship, you find mutual solutions that benefit both partners, that can be spread in the wider network and so on. And that becomes more and more common to address among companies as well. If we take a particular look at the managerial challenges among these actors, let's start with a shipper perspective, and that's the product supply chain actors. The shipper buys services, and the shippers in general, they want to be sustainable because of general market requirements, at least those who we talk to. Of course, there's the issue of greenwashing and so on, but most state, they want to be sustainable. Their problem is that the customers, that can be the consumers, also industrial customers, are less willing to pay when it costs more to become environmentally improving. And one of the big challenges here is, well, even if you want to become more environmentally conscious and be active, how do you require a green logistics service? And there are two main problems with this that we have encountered, where one is knowing too little. So you require very bluntly something that might not be right, or knowing too much, and you make a very specific requirement that actually doesn't do the job because it obscures the network of the logistics service provider. And that is not good for the system performance. So we think, and most companies that we talk to agree with this, that the remedy to this is to ask, not just require, to discuss together and to negotiate and to find joint solutions that satisfy both sides. And then you can really learn how the other side works. The shipper also has some important trade-offs to encounter or to take care of and to take position in. I mentioned two here. One is the cost-time trade-off. Many of the logistics services that go green include getting more efficient, like better transport planning, better system design of different types, optimization, as Joe mentioned. And these also tend to save costs, And that means they save resources. And in many aspects, they also save fuel, which is transformed directly into carbon dioxide emissions. So then you can say that cost and environmental things, they go together. But there is also often the case that more environmental friendly services takes more time to produce. Waiting a little bit, not having so much press on the logistics system leaves time to find more optimal solutions. And shippers often want their deliveries very fast. And we as consumers also do in the e-commerce trade. There's also a trade-off between cooperation and competition, because although we say that cooperation is good for finding new solutions in green supply chains, you tend to get, you dig quite deeply into this relationship, you get stuck, and you lose the competitive side of it sometimes, and you get locked in a relationship. So that's the downside of doing too much cooperation. So let's turn to the logistics service provider perspective, see what challenges do they have managerial wise. Well, they buy services and equipment. That's their role, because we use the LSP label, and it's a very comprehensive label. It's one label for many functions. And we have defined 3 functions here that are quite essential. It's the haulier, who owns the equipment, the trucks, the systems, and who employs the drivers. It's a forwarder function that connects different customer needs into a network. And it's a 3PL provider that can be warehousing solutions or help to run the logistics planning function for a company, for instance. Sometimes they are under the same roof in the same company, but there are also chains that we can see of different companies performing these different tasks. Of course, these companies also want to be sustainable. And when we ask them why, they say that society expects it, and in the future we will need to be there for future customers. However, their immediate customers today are less demanding on this side, at least when it comes to paying for services. Sometimes these logistics service providers need to invest, and it's difficult for them to invest for different reasons. And the customers are less willing to contribute to pay for the service that is greener and not better in any other sense. Of course, the LSPs encounter the shippers' specific requirements, which might, as I said before, obscure their total system and make the specific solution for a specific customer cause problems for the network as a whole. And that can be a problem. So negotiate, talk, discuss to find joint solution and understand each other better is our suggestion for that. For hauliers, now there is a big question mark in this when they are going to invest in new equipment in particular, because which technology will there be in the future? Will it be electrified cars, or will they use biofuels of different kinds? Which type of trucks should we order? And when they order trucks, it takes 1 or 2 years before they arrive. And I'm saying this in Sweden, we have 2 big global truck manufacturers here, and they still don't deliver. We all know the problems with the supply chains now. So this is quite a tough decision for these companies, and in particular for the hauliers. The hauliers are in a low margin business, and they are often small companies, so they have quite little investment capital to make these investments, so they need help with that. And we also see different business model emerging now to help this. Either, for instance, the vehicle manufacturers put up the money in the form of lease contracts for the hauliers, and sometimes even actors in the supply chain, like trading companies. We have seen examples of that as well. They buy those electrified cars and they lease it to their LSPs in turn, so they don't have to stand up for the capital. But these are problems that need to be solved. And there's also the shortage of drivers, which puts extra stress on the planning of transport and logistics systems. And short-term customer contracts is always a problem for these companies and for their investments. When we look at pressures for increasing logistics efforts, why do they really want to go green? Kind of similar, but still different pictures emerges, whether which perspective you take. For shippers, it's their customers, the society at large, and of course, efficiency that drives change towards more green logistics efforts. When we take a look at the LSPs, logistics service providers, it's also the customers, which are the shippers, but also the customers' customers, of course, because this is transferred directly to them in the supply chain. And for hauliers, it can also be forwarders who put pressures on them to invest in more technology and so on. Society holds a pressure, and of course, as it's a low margin business, efficiency is core, finding efficiency and cutting costs, of course. But for logistics service providers, they also mention policy and regulations as a pressure that forces them forward. And they actually ask for more, at least those we talk to. They would like more. I'm sending that on to you in the audience to dwell upon. So what you can see here is similar labels, but they push in somewhat different directions. So some remarks here: customers, they may be barriers and drivers depending on if they are wanting to go green, wanting to invest, or if they don't. So they are very strong forces for all these actors. Even though both parties are concerned with efficiency and costs, they make these efficiencies in very different ways. Because in the product supply chain, they work with linear logic and try to optimize their supply chains, whereas the LSPs work on a network logic where they need to gather the needs from many, many companies and make that efficient and optimized. And this could be a whole lecture in itself because it's really complicated, but it's very important to understand that, I think. And policy here, I put it, policy sticks out because the LSPs, they really experience policy pressure, but could expect more. And the shippers, they never mention policy pressure as a means for change. So to my concluding remark, I want to say that greening logistics is an effort of many. It's not only LSPs and manufacturing or trading firms that I have referred to, but there are, of course, many, many more actors, including official actors. And it needs orchestration to become really efficient and optimized and green in the end. The challenges, they include the challenges of different positions and different perspectives among the actors. But the challenges also call for increased collaboration to understand these perspectives in a better way. And that can be a challenge for management in both these types of firms. And what I have discussed here is mostly market-driven solutions, and they may work to some extent, but they may also not work depending on different things. And they may work in parts of the world that can afford these solutions. And also in calm times, with reference, Joe, to what you talked about COVID, and we also have this war on the European continent right now that obscures things. The question is, for the sake of this environment, can we wait for these market solutions? And I would say we need some pressure from policy as well. Policy definitely has a very important role to play. And the shipper side is so far untouched by policy in their own saying. And I know this might be provocative because you described previously that there are some policy measures in play, but our shippers don't experience that so much. So with that, I finish my presentation and leave the word back to you, Hugo.
Yes, thanks again, Maria. Thanks very much for, again, yet another very illuminating presentation. I know both of you had a lot to cover and appreciate that the topic's also quite complex. We have some questions that have already come in to the Q&A. Our original stop time was in about 10 minutes, but if Jose, who's my webinar partner on this, agrees, maybe we can go over another 10 minutes if there's enough discussion. I think both of you, really interestingly, I mean, I'm looking at this a little bit from a WTO perspective, have focused quite a bit on policy and the need for policy drivers to bring about the greening of supply chains. Now, we'll come to that, but in the meantime, the audience have put forward a few questions. I think some of them you've actually already sort of touched upon or even answered. There's one here asking about what areas of future research between supply chains and Industry 4.0. I think your slide actually did lay out a number of new research areas, Professor Sarkis in particular. We also have a question about, can green supply chains be green without digital technologies? And we have one here, I think, Professor Sarkis again, about the effectiveness of due diligence or the evidence of the effectiveness of due diligence. And maybe a couple here for you, Maria. It's a question about why short-term customer contracts could be a barrier or is a barrier to greening logistics. And there's a last one, I'm giving you all in one go, basically in the interest of time, about what are the performance metrics for circular economy. Maybe we could start with the more general ones about, digital technologies and green supply chains. Professor Sarkis, would you have a comment on that?
Can you green supply chains without digital technologies? Yes. And I give you the example here. The question that could be asked is, do digital technologies contribute to less green supply chains? And there's an argument that says yes, that without digital technologies, you can actually have a greener supply chain. Why? Because digital technologies require a lot of energy. So if you're looking at an energy perspective, yes, get rid of the digital technologies and you'll have less energy usage. Okay, that's one way of greening the supply chain without digital technologies. A lot of what you're doing, and also the other part of digital technologies, and this is the argument I always make, is that there's negative environmental consequences to the hardware that you're using. You've got what are you going to do with all that electronic waste? So if you use less digital technologies, you have less hardware, less storage, less data. So that makes your supply chain greener. But I don't think that's the way you were asking that question. I'm just saying, yes, you can. It's a matter of fact, there's aspects that help you become greener, but you need, and I mentioned this in implied in one of the results, is that behavior, acceptance, and management are probably 10 times more important than technology. Mm-hmm. So yes, you need that first. You need a cultural change to say this is important. That's where it all starts. And you don't need digital technologies to tell you that something is important or not. That's where the science is already showing. So I'll just keep it at that.
So that's great. And I'd like to focus on the behavioral aspects, because I think both of you did sort of raise this, that, if we're going to bring about change, behavioral aspects are quite important. I think both of you also talked about behavioral aspects from both a managerial perspective, but also from the customer's perspective, and try to link that to one of these questions here about customers and customer contracts. I'm not sure whether it's phrased exactly as it should, but nevertheless, to you, Maria, why could customer contracts be a barrier to greening logistics? Or maybe you want to talk more generally about customer behavior and the greening of logistics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, why short-term customer contract is a barrier to greening logistics? Well, if an LSP, a logistics service provider, is supposed to, because we often point finger to those actors because they are the ones causing the environmental harm. So we point fingers to them and ask them to do something. And they can do a lot of things and they know actually what to do. But every change they do is costly for them. Sometimes they need to invest and sometimes they need to invest time. and maybe they need to invest in more education to produce those solutions. And that means investments, and investments need a payoff period. Even if they also earn money from doing these efforts, it needs a payoff period. And that's why they need longer term contracts to be safe to do this investment and not to risk going to bankruptcy, because they have, as I said, very small margins. So they don't have these investment margins themselves for short term, fast changes. So that's one response to that.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to be picking and choosing here because we have quite a lot of questions. Let me turn to one which, it's a very straightforward question in one way. It's about what is the share of green logistics in the total market for logistics? And then linked to that is, are there, or let's say, what type of environmental policies could help induce both shippers and LSPs to increase green logistics efforts? And let me add to that, when you say environmental policies, trade policies, I mean, to the extent that we can think about trade policies that could help increase green logistics efforts. To the both of you, actually, I don't know who would like to start, Joe or Maria.
I think Maria would be a better person to start.
Okay.
I can start on some of it, and I think policy, the case where I have seen policy work towards shippers is in the city context, where municipalities can say that we don't allow deliveries in this city area or this geographical area unless they are performed by fossil-free vehicles, for instance. And then, of course, all the shippers that want their goods delivered into that area, they need to buy green services. So that is one way of inducing by policy, forcing the shippers to order green logistic services. So that is one concrete example of how it can be done. Joe, you referred to these due diligence things. Is that connected to this as well?
Yeah, that could probably be connected as well, depending on what the due diligence is. If, for example, this is more of a social, there's a lot more examples from a social perspective where there's liability issues, criminal intent, then unfortunately not enough for the environmental side. But from a criminal intent, imagine that you're a shipper who is trading in slave labor, for example. You're going to make it more sustainable by not doing that, because it's a regulation, a policy that international slave trade is illegal on these shippers. So they have to maintain systems in place to be able to monitor that. But the other side of this, and that an environmental policy, is that there are environmental policies, and I'm looking at the international maritime shipping. And we did a little bit of study related to international ship liners thing and carbon emissions using co-opetition and all these things. But we also realized that different regions of the world have certain rules. For example, in the UK region, we know that there's different rules, environmental policies, as to the type of fuel and the amount of emissions that you could bring out of your shipping liners, the amount of emissions that come from boats, essentially, from ships. And these rules require you to rethink how you do your policy. And some of them even have ships dumping a certain type of fuel to put in another type of fuel. And it looks like, hold it, there's a bad thing occurring here for a good reason, but it's a bad thing. You're using all this fuel and you're dumping it so that you can have a cleaner emissions in one region of the world. So those are some, yes, there are things that require shippers and logistics to do better things, but you got to be careful about some of these rules, is the way I look at it as well. Of course, shippers don't want to dump any fuels. They want to use it as efficiently as possible. So then you have to design a system where the fuels are used up in a certain way. That's just one example for green. But there's probably every policy, from my perspective, has a greening aspect to it. And whether or not you do it, whether it helps greening or whether it hurts greening. And I think that's something that a policy developer has to consider. If you're going to put a policy in place for trade, what are the greening and sustainability implications? I'm not sure if that is always the top consideration. Usually it's economic. Environmental plays a less role, but that's a separate issue, I guess.
No, that's really interesting. And what you said about the consequences of policies and some of the sort of sometimes even well-intentioned policies going terribly wrong because certain consequences were not considered. And that brings us to, I think, a question which I found really interesting, because I think it recurs a lot when we talk about circular economy, which you spoke about, Joe. This question: should circular economy be global or local? And what might be key arguments, pro and con, that emerge in that discourse? So, any thoughts on that?
Con is where I'm going to start. Usually it's everything's pro, but I'm going to start out with a con. A lot of international, and I'm going to use the electronics and plastics, that a lot of countries, developed countries, take these wonderful materials and say, oh, they can be recycled. There's value in this. So why don't we send them over to a developed country to process our waste for us? Because that's a circular economy principle. Essentially what that is dumping waste on another region that may not be capable of doing it. That's a con associated with globalization of the circular economy. And it's a big issue associated with it. The other side of that is it provides opportunities to less developed regions of the world. If we're going to take a developing regions of the world, that this is resources that informal economies can take advantage of. So there's a benefit there of helping from a social equity perspective, because some places in the world, this is the only resource that some of these informal economy workers have to be able to do that. This is an informal economy type of circular economy. And there's also regionalization, and you could have like systems within broader systems as well that can develop the economies in different regions of the world. So those are some of the issues. There's a con, and there's positives and there's negatives, and there's more of a listing. But I'll let Maria take over.
Yeah, just tap into what you just said. It's I agree to what you say, of course. About regional or local or global, we need to consider the transportation, because logistics, environmental imprint comes from transportation to a very high extent. And if we transport outdated computers or cars or whatever around the world in laps and laps, it doesn't help the environment either. So we need to consider that. So based on that, I'd say if you can reuse things locally, regionally, nationally, that's more wise from a logistics perspective than shipping them around the globe. I mean, we should be more accustomed to use our own things to reproduce and so on. I think that's one key.
Yeah, if I can jump on that, and I'm thinking of shipping here as a big shipping liner. One of the things that I wrote about many years ago is how wonderful that the circular economy can help in the utilization of large shipping liners. For example, cars and goods are sent from China to the United States, but the United States is not exporting back to China. You have all these big empty containers. Yeah. So what can you send back? Well, you can send back cardboard, plastic that can be recycled, computer systems that all can be recycled. So you could take advantage of this excess capacity going back to China, bringing back resources instead of them mining the earth. That was the theory. So what goes into place? China puts in, for example, plastics. China puts in a policy that we will not take the world's plastics anymore. What happens to the efficiencies of the supply chain there? This is, and they're doing it for a good reason, because it's very wasteful. It's very dangerous to their environment. It's just waste. They have to ban some of this stuff. They have to ban some electronics that are very dangerous to the environment over there. But it loses that efficiency of taking those resources back, whether it's paper resources or something else that can be recycled. So these are where policies and efficiencies come into play when you're talking about logistics and greening of logistics as well.
Okay, thanks. I mean, that was a really interesting responses to those questions. Can I just throw in one? Would you agree that, when we think about circular economy, that we need a very good and very robust regulatory framework that accompanies it to avoid some of the challenges that you already mentioned about shipping waste from one part of the world to the other. And that if we do manage to have such a regulatory framework in place, would that reduce the risk of some of the environmental consequences that you mentioned?
I think they do have the Basel Treaty for at least electronic waste. They do have some treaties in place, but not all the countries are signatories to those treaties. Mm-hmm. Now, can the WTO help, saying, hey, you got to bring this in to be part of the WTO? Maybe, but I think you're going to get a lot of pushback saying, what does this have to do with trade? This is all environmental stuff. I look at it as being, those two are integrated. Those two are together. No matter what you do, there are going to be environmental implications. You should do it. But a lot of countries are going to say, no, I signed up to the World Trade Organization to be all about trade, to all be about economics. Why are you making me do all of these other political, social things that are unnecessary? And it's a barrier to us for making these things. That's the counter argument. So I don't know what the answer is, but that's what I'm thinking in terms of even putting down regulations to circular economy. And there are circular economy regulations right now, but they're regional. For example, the WE regulations on electronic waste are regional. You can't, if you're going to do business in Europe, you have to follow WE requirements or RoHS requirements as well. Now, should the WTO adopt those internationally, and what does that mean? I don't know. And one of the questions I saw was, have you found some of these due diligence laws with a difference? For example, let's consider WE as a due diligence law. And I mentioned this very quickly in the presentation. The WE regulations are waste electronic regulations. They found that the regulations, when they're put into place, at least in Europe, has a 46% recycling rate for electronic waste. US has no federal rules. The level of recycling in the United States is 4%. So yes, policies and due diligence laws with teeth do make a difference. And it's not all behavioral. There's a clear explanation that these penalties, these coercive regulatory policies do work. The big stick should not be left out of the whole conversation. This is why I used to be, oh yeah, market mechanisms and all these voluntary rules, oh, they'll work. No, I've gotten a lot more cynical and skeptical over the years about that.
Right, great. I think we've gone past the time allocated, but I think you've sort of managed to generate so much interest and discussion that it was really well worth going over the time. But I think will need to wrap up. Just a very quick thing on your mention about WTO and trade. I think it's just useful to say that what we're seeing at the moment is that there are groups of members, fairly large groups of members, who are now engaging in different initiatives called Trade and Environmental Sustainability is one. Another one is on plastics pollution, where they are trying to grapple with these issues that you mentioned, Joe, about what is trade, what is environment, and I think at the end of the day, we're moving towards a situation where making these sorts of distinctions are no longer so easy or necessarily that desirable. But anyway, it's work in progress, and people are working on that.
Yeah. There's a lot of good stuff out there. For example, one of my colleagues, Su Tian from Shanghai University, she introduced me to the idea of embedded environmental values in terms of goods that are traded. And instead of doing it based on how much economics or money is being transferred back and forth in the trade, look at it as how much environmental resources are being traded. That would be a very interesting thing that WTO should look into if they haven't already. But you mentioned some of those rules and so on.
So to be fair to the audience, I had these last three questions, and I'm going to take them all at once and also give you your final remarks. So it's going to be a big ask of you. So there was one here about what are the performance measurement metrics for circular economy. There was one asking for more precision on the slide by you, Maria, on transport infrastructure, where you said transport infrastructure is not addressing greening logistics. Why is that? Seemed to be the question. Mm-hmm. And then the last one I have is, could you explain the role of ISO standards in blockchain-based supply chain? I leave it to you which ones you feel you want to answer or feel that you can answer. So over to you, and we'll wrap up after that.
I can go first on that. I was a bit fast there. What we study when we study, we take off in the logistics demand side, the shippers, and the logistics service provider side, which is the transport layer. The infrastructure layer is there, of course, and it's so important for the transport to work. But we don't address that specifically when we do research, but we do it indirectly when we study the LSPs, logistics service providers, and say, what are their needs? Okay, they need a functioning infrastructure, which is a hot question right now for electrification of freight transport, of course. We need infrastructure. It's a big cry for that. It's not there. We don't have the power. We don't have the infrastructure, so we can't electrify. So in those cases where it's a crucial factor, of course, it's included in the research. But those actors managing the infrastructure, they are very seldom core in green logistics research. If that is rephrasing it, moderating it a little bit, I hope it makes sense.
And Joe, your final thoughts on performance metrics, maybe, and there's one here about ISO, but I'm not sure whether any of you want to address that right now.
Yeah, the performance metrics, as a matter of fact, the research that we're doing with the circular economy, you saw the blue heat map that I showed, was all about how do you go about where in the circular economy, global, whatever, practices that exist, and there's like 15 practices, can blockchain technology and its capabilities, or digitization in general and its capabilities, contribute to performance measurement and assessment of these aspects? And there's multiple aspects, like recycling. How well does recycling occur in different situations under different policies? To be able to manage at any level of decision making, whether it's policy, regionally, nationally, internationally, whether it's organizationally, whether it's in your supply chain, whether it's individual departments, whether it's your household, some measurement and metrics are required. Not all measures and metrics are equal in importance, or equal in accessibility, or equal in application for greening and so on. But you need to be able to know how to gather the data, gather the metrics, make sure the metrics that you have are correct and accurate. This is where consensus comes into play. This is where acceptance. So there's a whole process of, what is it, performance management systems that you should be putting into place. Now, usually we talk about performance management systems within companies, and they have been doing this talking for generations. Everything to manage. You can't manage what you can't measure. The question that I kind of wonder at is, can you take something like performance measurement at a global level, whether it's WTO, whether it's the United Nations, and actually develop performance measures that are equitable, that are easy to measure, that are feasible, and that actually get something done? Right now, the United Nations has the SDGs, and the SDGs have, 170 different performance measures to go for their 17 different areas. But realistically, what's going on there? And this is a big concern, that one of the issues is that there's trade-offs within the measures themselves. And this is going to be a situation where if WTO tries to put in performance measures for the environment, how well and what are the trade-offs aligned with the economic measures that they use right now? And this kind of alludes to some of the stuff I was talking about, embedded environmental values and performance measures. Some systems are very well developed. Our economic systems, the dollars, even though there's problems with it, monetary units that are being traded are very clear, very well accepted. They're part of treaties. Environmental performance, what do you mean by that? Social performance, that's out of the question. So how do you go about integrating all these different performance items into a system that's acceptable for all the players and that really does make a change? And going back to our original discussion, climate change, carbon emissions, how do we know that we're performing well, that we're even close to net zero? And where do we draw the boundaries around these? There's just so many different questions. I could go on and on and on, But you see, this is just scratching the surface. This one question, you start digging, you start peeling the onion back, and you have more and more and more problems that creep up the more you dig into it. And this has been the history of performance measurement since I've been working on the areas. So that's...
No, great. Thank you so much. I thank the both of you. Been a great, fascinating discussion. Thanks to the audience for staying, even though we went over time. I think it was such a good discussion that many people stayed on. It will probably not be the last time we'll be addressing this issue. So hopefully we'll have a chance to talk to you again in the future. Some of these issues will be in our World Trade Report for 2022, which is on the bigger trade and climate change discussion. So we look forward again to have all of your inputs and discussions and feedback at a future point. My thanks to all my colleagues who helped put together this webinar, Jose Antonio Montero in particular, and to all the colleagues in the relevant divisions from economic research, trade and environment, and also those supporting the webinar. Thank you all again, and thanks again.
Thank you.